Welcome to This Moment in Democracy. I'm Saladin Ambar. On today's episode, we speak to civil rights lawyer Will Creeley to learn how current anti-abortion legislation can impinge on freedom of speech and what rights students on campus need to know when it comes to free speech. This podcast was recorded on Thursday, November 3rd, 2022. Will is the director of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE. FIRE is a nonprofit civil liberties group founded in 1999 with the aim of protecting free speech rights on college campuses in the United States. FIRE was renamed in June 2022 with its focus broadened to free speech rights across American society in general. Since joining FIRE in 2006, Will has successfully defended expressive rights and core civil liberties nationwide. As legal director, Will coordinates FIRE's legal advocacy and oversees FIRE's litigation, legislative and policy reform, and targeted advocacy departments. He has appeared on national television and radio on FIRE's behalf and has spoken to thousands of students, faculty, administrators, and attorneys about First Amendment rights at events across the country. He's the co-author of First Things First, a modern course book on free speech fundamentals, and his writing has been published by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and other outlets. Will, it is so good to have you here with us today. Welcome.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor.
Well, there's so much to talk about in this moment with respect to free speech, but I thought we'd begin by first having you share, if you don't mind, how you first got interested in free speech and free expression, and then we can maybe dig into some of the policy issues that your work touches on.
Oh, my pleasure. That's a good question. Thank you for indulging me. My father was a poet, and I grew up very interested in the power of words generally. I was aware as a young fan of groups like Public Enemy and work by some of my father's friends like Allen Ginsberg of the controversy that can be caused when one speaks one's truth or challenges established notions or dissents from the prevailing view or criticizes those in power. So those were formative ideas for me as a child, and then certainly as a teenager. I went to college. I worked as a journalist. I studied political theory, and I went to law school because I wanted to figure out how to speak the language of power. I thought it'd be fun to go into the belly of the beast and see if I could perform delicate surgery, as I thought. And in one of the all-time blessings of my life, of which I'm very fortunate to have many, I linked up with FIRE and was a research assistant and an intern for the man who was then FIRE's legal director and is now our president and CEO, Greg Lukianoff. And I did a lot of work on freedom of conscience that summer, and I also helped out professors who were having their own rights violated. So it was a really interesting combination of theoretical work and practical impact. You know, if you get a letter from somebody saying, "Thank you so much for your help," that's very gratifying. That's all I ever wanted as an attorney. And I was lucky enough to join FIRE after graduating from NYU Law, and I've been here ever since. So 16 years later, it's still interesting, still engaging, and I feel very lucky to do this work. And I got to say, now more important than ever, it seems like.
Well, you have spoken to my heart and outed me as a devotee of Public Enemy and also who teaches political theory. So you made my day with those two shout outs. So I appreciate it.
I still have the singles at home.
Let's not, this will turn into a hip hop podcast in a minute. So we don't want to do that. But in all seriousness, could you share what has happened in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision? We did a podcast not long ago about Dobbs, but with respect to freedom of speech, there's been some rumblings out of South Carolina and other states that seem to implicate very strongly free speech. Could you just share a little bit what's going on around the country and what your role has been in addressing some of these issues?
Sure. Yeah. And if you've had an explanation of Dobbs prior, then I won't attempt to recapture that discussion. But just for the purposes of the conversation here, Dobbs overturns Roe v. Wade. And as a result, the heretofore recognized constitutional right to an abortion comes off the books. And now the matter is kicked back to states who have a freer hand to legislate with regard to abortion, restricting it, criminalizing it in certain instances, and also, and this is where the First Amendment issues come into play, attempting to regulate how citizens of a given state can talk about abortion, how they can provide information about abortion, and so forth. So folks probably saw in the wake of the Dobbs decision, maybe some listeners even have signs with this slogan emblazoned on it themselves, I will aid and abet abortion. And what I've been pointing out is that phrasing, I will aid and abet abortion, is very deliberate. If it sounds like a kind of obscure legal term of art, that's because it is. The idea of aiding and abetting someone in committing a crime is what's now under question here. So that slogan and those signs and those T-shirts are a determined and somewhat rueful recognition of the fact that if abortion is criminal, those who help people get abortions, and even if they help in some instances get information about abortions, are also participating in a criminal act. They're aiding and abetting the facilitation of a criminal act. So that's the logic of that phrase, or the power of that phrase on those shirts. And you mentioned South Carolina. It's a good example. Just days after Dobbs is released by the court, the Dobbs decision, it's released by the court, legislators in South Carolina quickly introduced a bill that would punish performing or inducing abortions with 25 years in jail. But and this is where the First Amendment angle comes in. They would also make it punishable by that same quarter century of hard time to, quote, knowingly or intentionally aid, abet, or conspire with another person to obtain an abortion. And if that may raise questions. Well, what does it mean to aid and abet? Does it mean driving a car to a clinic, taking someone out of state to obtain an abortion? And for our purposes as a civil liberties organization dedicated to protecting free speech, what does it mean about speech? And, somewhat usefully for our purposes, the bill text is very specific and precise on this point. And if you allow me, I'll just quote from it. Quote, providing information to a pregnant woman or someone seeking information on behalf of a pregnant woman by telephone, internet, or any other mode of communication regarding self-administered abortions or the means to obtain an abortion. So providing information, including providing information by telephone, internet, or any other mode of communication. So that's pretty broad.
Let me stop you there.
Yeah.
So an Instagram post, a tweet, something posted on Facebook, what have you, these theoretically can be used, at least under the heading of this type of law, could be used or considered, I should say, as aiding and abetting someone engaging in an abortion, which in certain states obviously would be a criminal act.
That's exactly right. The former president of the American Civil Liberties Union, Nadine Strawson, and I wrote a piece pointing out the breadth of this prohibition. We're talking about everything from a conversation with a partner or a sister or a brother, family member behind closed doors, to talking to a medical professional, to checking out library books. And we've seen in some states orders come down from on high from the powers that be in those states to say, you cannot, if you're a librarian, you cannot help a librarian patron check out certain books or research certain topics on the computer here, because that might violate a similar prohibition. So yeah, everything from how do we put it, TikTok posts to library books becomes possibly grounds for prosecution under this broad law. And then we started thinking about, that's just in the state, right? So what does this do if you are the publishers and editors of New York Magazine, which, if I'm not mistaken, published an issue either just before or just after Dobbs saying how to get an abortion, right? Talking about obtaining abortion pills via mail and so forth, right? So if you have a South Carolina subscriber to a national magazine like that, have the publishers and authors for New York Magazine violated this law if it lands on a South Carolinian's doorstep? So yeah, it gets tricky quick.
This to me is reminiscent of abolitionist literature, right, that was banned, right, from being transferred or delivered into the South.
That's right.
All kinds of forms of censorship applied in that era to that issue.
That's a great analogy. That's absolutely right. The whole question of free speech. Well, back then, free speech took on a very different connotation, right? It was literally speech from the free states. That's absolutely right. And yeah, it's the question of whether one state can export its de facto censorship regime across state borders.
Fair enough. Look, let's bring this down to our students at Rutgers University and elsewhere who may be listening. You say in your guide to free speech on campus that in FIRE's experience, few university lawyers have more than a passing knowledge of the First Amendment. Yeah. What should our students know about their rights to free speech on campus?
Well, that's a great question. They should know that as attendees of a public university, they have very robust First Amendment rights. You should have the same First Amendment rights when you go on to your public campus that you do when you are standing in front of City Hall. Now, public institutions and owners of government property, when the government opens its property, they can impose certain types of limitations on speech, reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. So in other words, you don't necessarily have the right to bring in a bullhorn to the student union, right? You certainly don't have your full First Amendment rights when you're in a non-public forum or a closed space like a classroom. So if a professor is in a classroom teaching, you don't have a First Amendment right to tell them to go to hell, right? You can expect a bad grade and your First Amendment defense will not fly. But conversely, if you'd like to stage a protest against Dobbs or in favor of Dobbs or whatever your point of view may be on the campus quad and the generally accessible public areas outdoors on campus, you have the First Amendment right to do so. And what we've often found, and I've been doing this long enough that I've defended, I think, speakers on both sides of every major issue from pro-life, pro-choice, Republican, Democrat, Israel, Palestine, all the way down, whatever. Think of a hot button issue, and we've probably been in on it, and I've probably defended both sides, is that you have the right to speak your mind, and the government cannot pick and choose who may speak on the basis of viewpoint. That's the bottom line rule. You can't say only Republicans can speak, only Democrats can speak, or you're liberal, we don't want to hear from you, you're conservative. You can't do that. The government cannot put a thumb on the scale in those instances.
I hear you. Well, and in full disclosure, I mean, a few years ago, and this is speaking personally, not for the Eagleton Institute, I was a signatory to that Harper's letter about free speech. So it certainly resonates with me, no matter what the issue is.
Right.
Although I want to come back maybe towards the end about maybe some concerns that listeners may have,
sure,
particularly in this moment where there's a lot of bad speech, frankly, if I could impose that on the audience going around, and a lot of deception in terms of what people are saying. I don't want to hold that and come back to that concern towards the end. But you mentioned, elsewhere that on public campuses that there's been a tendency to trample on the rights of conscience. Can you explain to our listeners what the right to conscience entails?
Yeah, I'll start with a story, if I may. One of my favorite, in fact, my favorite Supreme Court decision of all time, the court's decision in Barnett v. West Virginia Board of Education, which involved two sisters who were Jehovah's Witnesses, which is a much persecuted minority religious sect at the time, subject to really shocking acts of extrajudicial violence. As late as the early 40s, during the Second World War, they were tarred and feathered. They were castrated. They were forced out by mobs out of their homes. Their kingdoms' halls, their temples were burned down. Really just shocking violence against Jehovah's Witnesses. People were suspicious of Jehovah's Witnesses because they would not salute the flag. They took seriously the idea that thou shalt put no graven image above God, and that was part of their ethos and their faith. So these two young sisters in West Virginia refused to say the Pledge of Allegiance. They refused to participate in the pledge, and they were kicked out under a wartime loyalty oath provision. I'll just call it frankly what it was, passed by the West Virginia Board of Education, and they sued, and the case made its way to the High Court, and overturning a decision issued just a few years prior, the Supreme Court found that you have the right in this country, the First Amendment right, to think and say what you believe without government coercion. And it's just a beautiful opinion by Justice Robert H. Jackson. And I wish I had it in front of me right now to quote from because it to me, again, being the son of a poet, it is true poetry. But long story short, you have the opportunity in this country to make up your own mind, and the state cannot force you to speak. Here I go again, if you'll indulge me. If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. If there are any circumstances which permit an exception, they do not now occur to us. And this was a fascinating thing for the court to say, again, not only reversing an opinion just from a few years prior, which reached the exact opposite conclusion, but also at the height of a kind of wartime patriotic and nationalist drive to combat the forces of totalitarianism in the Axis. So at the moment when national unity arguably could be most compelled, right, by the state, we said, no, not in this country. We get to think for ourselves, and that's the basis of our strength. So to answer your question, a long-winded winded way, the bravery of those two young children to stand up for their rights and to earn that recognition from the court, and the humility of the court to recognize the harm done by its prior decision, which unleashed in many respects that violence against Jehovah's Witnesses. Fast forward that to today. The basic prohibition is against a public government actor forcing students or faculty to pledge their loyalty to a certain viewpoint. So where this comes up routinely these days is with diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Now, again, no matter how useful those initiatives may be as a matter of social policy or a matter of rectifying past injustices, racial, social, and otherwise, the point is that the state cannot say, we will only give you this job if you commit to our preferred viewpoint, whether that's a preferred viewpoint on racism, systemic inequality, or so forth. And that's something we've found across the country at this point, where public universities are asking job applicants to kind of pledge their fealty to a certain conception of anti-racism as a condition of being hired. And that makes us very nervous, in the same way that back in the late 50s and early 60s, really the entire 1950s and the early 60s, in some ways stretching into the 70s, public university faculty in many states were required to pledge that they had not been a member of any seditious organization or not socialist or communist. So that's a rough historical analog. And I imagine some listeners will bristle at that analog, saying, well, surely that was wrong and this is right. But the folks holding the power always think that the belief they're trying to compel is right. So we need to be very suspicious when the government starts asking you to pledge your faith in a certain notion of what's right and wrong. The government should not have that power.
Well, Will, I hear you, and I know many of our listeners are going to agree with you, but there'll be some for sure, perhaps many, who will also say, now, hold on a minute. You know, I was at home and I watched January 6th, 2021. I cut on the news the other night and I heard about the Speaker of the House, her husband being attacked, Paul Pelosi. I see a lot of violence, and a lot of it is from bad information, from people touting conspiracy theories about the government, about Biden, whomever, about what went down politically, and that what we have now is free speech run amok, and we've got to find a way to manage it. And this brings me to Twitter and to Elon Musk and his recent takeover, if you will, if I can use that term, of Twitter, and purchase of Twitter. What do you say? And I guess that this was me invoking that fear I was alluding earlier. How do you address those fears and concerns? That's question one. And then question two related to that is, what do you make of Musk's takeover of Twitter, and how do you think it will shape the future, at least in the foreseeable future, of free speech in this country? So,
those are great questions. Yeah, great questions, Professor. I'll take them in turn. First of all, the question of what to do about misinformation, malinformation, and disinformation, that's top of mind for us. In June, FIRE expanded from being the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education to being the Foundation for Individual Rights in Expression. In other words, we broadened our purview beyond campus to the First Amendment across the country, both on campus and off campus. And in the 4 or 5 months since that expansion, we have been talking about disinformation the entire time. And we understand that right now we have a moment where many, as you describe, are in having a crisis of faith with regard to the First Amendment. Is free speech really worth it? And it reminds me a little bit, thinking about the title of this podcast, This Moment in Democracy, that old saying about democracy, it's the worst of all possible systems except for all the other ones, right? So I kind of feel a little bit like that sometimes about free speech. It's not to say free speech is ever easy. My boss likes to call it the eternally radical idea, that it's always a radical idea to say, no, people should say what they want and we will get through it. And we will in fact be better off because people are allowed to say what they want. And I visit that in this current moment when we're worried about misinformation and malinformation and disinformation, right? If everybody's a publisher, if social media has democratized access to the minds of millions, what do we do when people are flooding the zone with shit, to use Steve Bannon's artful phrase? It's very descriptive. I apologize, pardon my French as a First Amendment attorney, something that comes too naturally for me. But, so what do you do? And I think that there's the most promising approach that I've seen thus far, the most thorough answer that I find really kind of reassuring and right, is you answer bad speech with more speech. It's the old civil libertarian saw, but it still holds true that in a moment where we're having crisis of faith in our institutions, and including the media, the answer is not to throw up our hands. The answer is not to empower the government to start cracking down on speech it dislikes, because and I know that as soon as a President Donald Trump gets into office, he's going to have one interview of misinformation. How many times did he call things fake news? Even National Weather Service reports, right? So that will happen if we say, government, you fix this problem. You hold the cudgel. You start chopping down on what you think is misinformation. Well, that will run into the ditch real quick. And the other option is allowing big tech companies to do it for us. And I'm not very confident in that either. Again, tech companies can change hands, and we'll get to that second question in just a second. So the only answer I really see as having any lasting power is for citizens who believe in the facts to support journalists and journalistic entities that they believe are reliable and publish the facts, and to support them not just with clicks, but with subscriptions, right? I think a valid response to this moment where we're having this crisis of information is to flock to journalists and journalistic entities and media outlets that are committed to telling the truth, and to patronize them, right? That's first of all. Second of all, just for readers who are interested in this, there's a long form discussion about what can be done in response to the problems of misinformation by the writer Jonathan Rauch, called The Constitution of Knowledge, where he makes what I think is a very stirring defense of freedom of expression as being the right answer in this fraught moment, but also what that means on a practical level with regard to outlets like Twitter, with problems like misinformation, where there are media outlets that are, objectively pumping out false information. And so it's a long form answer, but it's really worth reading. Okay, so that's misinformation. Long story short, it's protected by the First Amendment. The answer is more talking and more commitment to the truth, not handing over control to the government of social media. So Elon Musk, what do I think? I'm pretty skeptical, frankly. I have to say, I don't think any one person is going to be a quote unquote savior for free speech. I think already we've seen Musk in his first week on the job, recognizing the financial realities of running a social media outlet. I think advertisers are concerned that if it becomes a hate speech and troll-filled hellscape, which some might describe it already as, then advertisers are not going to spend money there. And the site will be a money loser for Musk. I think he's a businessman above all. I think it's very telling to see him say things like Twitter will follow the laws of the lands where it is. For someone who's got significant investments in China, which is a notorious state censor, what does that mean? Does that mean that anti-Chinese speech is going to be looked at differently? It might. Apple, another gigantic corporation, treats Apple TV very differently in China than it does in the United States. And so we've got different allowances for censorship based on the size of the market. And that makes me very nervous. So I guess the book is out on Elon, and we'll see. Our advice has always been that whatever social media companies do, and we recognize them as private actors with some real powers to define on their own terms without government involvement what the terms of use will be, but they should be clear, transparent. They should be viewpoint neutral. That is, they should treat both speech from both sides of the political spectrum, all sides of the political spectrum, the same. And they should remember that the First Amendment and the case law that goes along with it is kind of the longest sustained meditation on what it means to be applying freedom of expression on a daily basis out there. So we're not saying that Elon has to start applying First Amendment case law to Twitter disputes, but we are saying that the principles that we've arrived at through decades of thinking about how to mediate between power and individual rights and free speech, the case law is a pretty good guide. So that's kind of my quick answer. I guess we will stay tuned and see. I personally quit Twitter 95% quit Twitter a year ago, and I feel great. So I recommend.
I'll have to ask a quick follow-up to that. But as we begin to close, I want to ask you also about the midterms. But what led you to quit Twitter? You of all people.
Well, I tell you what, it sometimes feels like a professional imperative, but I am somebody who likes to be minute to minute on the news. And I wanted to start, reading more books and getting back into things that weren't just 240 characters. So after reading an article, I think in The Atlantic by, Caitlin Flanagan, who said, I quit Twitter and I feel great. I said, well, let me give it a try for a month. And then a month became 4 months. And, I log in once in a while just to tell folks what FIRE is up to, because I feel like that's my job as legal director. But, really, I've dialed back, and I'm here to tell you there's life after Twitter. So if you're out there and hopelessly, entrenched in your phone like I was, I'm here to tell you there's a better way.
Very good. Well, I'm glad somebody's reading books out there. That's pretty awesome. Look, have any of what we've talked about, and you've been very eloquent, and I thank you for taking the time today to share your views and to come on This Moment in Democracy and help our audience put some of these issues into perspective. Has any of what you and I have discussed, whether it's abortion or even this broader conversation of freedom of speech, from your sense, has it shaped the discourse and maybe put things in a way that are going to affect the midterm elections? Has anything up that has caught your attention as someone who undoubtedly follows politics?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the state laws that we saw proposed and in at least in South Carolina, at least were pulled back for now, those are very much on the table. If lawmakers who support those acts are reelected or elected, if we have this coming red wave, I think that could result in a set of threats to, we haven't talked about public libraries, which has been another big story for the past 3 months, to questions about what can be taught in our classrooms, thinking of our current lawsuit against the state of Florida and the quote unquote Stop Woke Act. So we've seen a lot of illiberal initiatives. And I should say there have also been some from Democratic politicians as well. But unless voters consider those initiatives as they vote and vote against the politicians who support measures that would restrict First Amendment rights, we'll see more of it. That's the only consequence that ultimately matters. A court can enjoin or strike down a law, but if the political appetite for that restriction of free speech remains, it'll keep coming. The only thing ultimately that can sustain freedom of expression is the electorate. I mean, you can have laws on the books and they can be ignored by politicians, certainly, and even in some cases judges. But the only thing that ultimately counts is that all of us value freedom of speech, not only for the thought we agree with, but also for the thought we disagree with. And that's a commitment. And we will see where that stands in about a week's time.
And how hopeful are you about that ability and possibility of the electorate, the American people, doing just that, upholding the right to free speech in days and maybe years?
Professor, I couldn't do this work if I wasn't an optimist. Put it like that. Ultimately, I believe that through the exchange of ideas, we get a little bit closer to understanding each other and understanding the value of protecting freedom of speech. And I think that the arc of history bends toward more speech. And so I'm still an optimist, and I will be tomorrow morning. And if the work gets harder, well, that's what we're here for.
Terrific. And for the one day a month or year that you're on Twitter, how can folks follow you?
Oh, thank you. I'm at Will, WILLAT at FIRE, FIRE. And if you're interested in any of this stuff, you can check out our website at thefire.org.
Will, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much, and I wish you well. Today's podcast has been brought to you by the Eagleton Institute of Politics. Eagleton is a nonpartisan research unit of Rutgers University, New Brunswick. This moment in democracy was made possible in part by the generosity of Gerald and Kiko Harvey and Eagleton's many supporters. To support Eagleton's work or sign up for its newsletter, click the links in the description. To learn more about the Institute, visit eagleton.rutgers.edu and follow Eagleton on social media.